Hello and welcome to this edition of Ismaili Center Lecture Series Virtual Edition. My name is Zara Premji and it's an absolute honor to be here with you from my living room here in Vancouver. Now I'm quite excited to introduce our next guest, who's Khalil Shariff. He's the CEO of Aga Khan Foundation Canada and has been for the last 15 years. Now, his resume speaks volumes, from being an alum at the University of British Columbia to being an alumni at Harvard. He has brought many talents and skills together to the position that he has today. His passion for humanitarian service and his love for helping the greater community and humanity as a whole has brought him to where he is today. And without further ado, let's welcome Khalil.
Well, thank you, Zara, for those very generous words of introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a genuine delight and privilege to be with you this evening, to be welcomed into each of your homes for this launch of the virtual set of Ismaili Center lectures. I'm joining you from my home here in Ottawa, where we have been physically distancing like I think many of you have been for now several weeks. This is the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, and just meters from where I'm sitting here, there are three rivers that come together, and the Algonquin for centuries have been coming together at this place called Ottawa, where the three rivers meet in a spirit of exchange of goods and services, for certainly, but also of relationships and critically of ideas. And so it's a very special privilege to be continuing that centuries-old Canadian tradition of exchanging ideas and relationships, even as we do so more virtually than perhaps was ever before possible. It's also, of course, a privilege to be asked to speak on the world post-crisis, looking past this COVID crisis. I do so with some, of course, anxiety, because we are at a moment which is highly unusual, almost unprecedented probably, and where any glance to the future is likely to have a very tentative flavor to it as we still learn about the situation we're confronting and as it evolves very, very quickly. I'm finally very privileged to be joining you because I finally have a chance to put on a tie after several weeks of not wearing one. My undistinguished but well-used tie collection has been languishing at the bottom of my closet, and this one at least is very happy to have been released from quarantine, at least for tonight's important event. Ladies and gentlemen, human civilization has known crisis from the beginning of history. It is no stranger to crisis. Empires rise and empires fall. But just as crisis is a fact of human history, so, of course, is resilience, the ability of human communities to bounce back, and often to bounce back even better. But, of course, resilience itself is not inevitable. It doesn't happen as a matter of automatic lockstep process. Again and again, I think what we've learned is that resilience in the face of crisis is a choice. It must be embraced. And one of our great challenges at this crisis in history is to understand what are the choices we confront and what are the choices open and available to us to choose resilience. The power of that choice was powerfully recounted by His Highness the Aga Khan when he spoke at the gold medal ceremony of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada here in Ottawa in 2013. He chose that moment, that occasion of receiving the gold medal from the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada to reflect a little bit on some of the choices in the architectural efforts he had initiated globally. And he spoke especially about Canada. And I want to read an excerpt about the way in which His Highness framed response to crisis. He talked about the arrival of Ismailis in Canada in the 1970s. He says the story goes back to 1972 when the then president of Uganda, Marshal Idi Amin, expelled all the Asians from Uganda, no matter what their faith, their citizenship, or position in society. He said many thousands left Uganda in a matter of days. Most took nothing more with them than their brains and the languages they spoke. He called it one of the ugliest experiences of ethnic cleansing in those times. He said that the leaders of the Ismaili communities in the UK and Canada consulted with one another and with me as to how to respond to this forced migration. There was unanimity that wherever we would settle, we would never become a demotivated, marginalized minority, and that we would instead demonstrate the will and the capacity to rebuild our future. He carried on to say that as they thought about building new spaces, new Ismaili centers, he said that he committed at that moment with the leaders of the community that these new buildings would be symbols of new hope, replacing past pain. This is an extraordinary example of the way in which a community, and indeed all communities, can confront even very, very difficult moments of crisis and of difficulty with a sense of optimism and hope for the future. One of the things I've learned in my time over the last several years with the Aga Khan Development Network system is that an important approach to dealing with crisis situations wherever they erupt in the world is to respond to them with a certain bifocal vision, with one of our eyes and one of our lenses looking very squarely and with a focused way on responding to the urgent needs that we are confronting today. But with the other eye and with our other lens, looking even now past the crisis, so that we are able to look to the future and establish the mechanisms and the ingredients for how we might build post-crisis, even during the crisis. So the burden of my remarks today are really to unravel how is it that we might look at the current crisis with this bifocal vision. How can we ensure that even as we deal with the immediate needs in front of us, we can do so in a way that looks past the crisis and that begins to establish the foundation stones and the ingredients for rebuilding with strength and progress and success post this crisis? My view, my speculation, my proposal is that there are four things we might keep in mind, four principles, cornerstones of an approach to dealing with the crisis that might help us put in place the ingredients for life post this crisis. So principle number one is we need to help each other. You know, at moments of crisis, often we'll find forces that pull us apart start becoming stronger and stronger, that the forces of division become stronger and stronger, that the incentive and maybe the appetite to blame and to scapegoat become very severe. It is my view that at moments of crisis, these forces of division are exactly the wrong response. They are the things that are going to be the most dangerous, and that people of goodwill and of long-term orientation must seek to overpower those forces that pull us apart with forces that bring us together. You know, even pre-COVID, there were many people in the world who were concerned that globally, as a result of certain political and social forces, there were many trends of fragmentation, of forces pulling us apart that were deeply worrying, that we were confronted with a great choice as humanity as to whether we were going to understand our condition as being a condition where we are in it for ourselves or a condition in which we were all in this together. And again, I think it is clear that the most successful approach to underwriting a future of peace and prosperity for us all is to adopt the mindset that we are all in this together. Now, Margaret Mead, the acclaimed anthropologist, was once asked what she had understood to be the origins of human civilization. And her response was that, in her view, human civilization begins in the archaeological record at the site of discovery of the first human fossil of the thigh bone that had been broken and repaired. Her reflection was that in the animal world, you would never find such a fossil of a thigh bone, such a critical bone in the animal or human's ability to function physically. You would never find an example of a broken thigh bone that had been repaired. That is a uniquely human phenomenon, because for that thigh bone to have been repaired meant that another human would have come to rescue the person who was hurt, would have helped that person get to a safe place, would have tended and cared for that person until the bone had healed. She said that the essence of human civilization was the capacity of people to help each other. Well, at moments of crisis, this idea of helping each other has to be the biggest theme guiding everything that we do to conduct ourselves. Even the imperatives of the public health guidelines that we've been given to stay at home, to distance ourselves physically, to wash our hands, to wear face masks, are as much about protecting ourselves as they are about protecting people around us. They themselves and our commitment to adhering to them, in a sense, is also an expression of this idea of helping each other. So that's principle number one, to embrace the idea that we are all in this together. That if we conduct ourselves now in the face of the immediate crisis with this in mind, that we will lay the ingredients for a sense of solidarity post-crisis that will give us the strength to continue to build an inclusive future for us all. Principle number two is to think institutionally, not just individually. Another thing that I have learned in my years with the Aga Khan Development Network system, looking especially at societies in the developing world, is how difficult it is and how rare it is for us to find networks of strong institutions that can help societies advance. You know, here in Canada, we are surrounded by rich social, political, and economic institutions that support us, that they're almost become invisible to us. But let us never forget that our network of schools and hospitals and universities and governance institutions, from City Hall all the way to the national government and everything in between, even the critical institutions of the private sector, banks and financial institutions, that thick network of institutions are the ingredients that allow us to both advance in our everyday life, but also that come together to create a safety net at moments of crisis. Let us never take those institutions for granted, because in many parts of the world, there are populations simply cannot count on that network of institutions being present. And these are institutions for sure in the public sector, in the private sector, but as many of you will know, for the AKDN system, institutions crucially of civil society. This idea of private energies coming together for public purposes. Institutional strength is, in a sense, the secret weapon of society's ability to advance. Now, in moments of crisis, we often find that institutions' fragilities are uncovered. But when an institution's fragility is uncovered, our response to that shouldn't be to abandon the institution, it should be to redouble our efforts to invest in those institutions. So when you look around and look at all the ways in which we were either unprepared for this crisis or in which the institutions that are built to serve us have somehow fallen short, we shouldn't lose hope in those institutions. This should be a moment when we recommit to those institutions and invest in our reimagination of what those institutions could be into the future. In fact, one of my convictions is that our capacity as a society to engage in a process of continual institutional renovation and reinvention is going to be key to our forward success. There are many people who are saying that the post-COVID world is going to look different from the world before the COVID. And therefore, we're going to need different kinds of capacities in our institutions, maybe even whole new institutions, to be able to cope with the challenges and difficulties and opportunities that are going to be presented to us in the future. What it says to me is that we need to have a strong institutional vision and commitment now, even in the context of addressing the crisis today, so that we are left with strong institutions who can help us after the crisis. There is a very famous German play in which there is a dialogue between two characters, and the first character says, unhappy, he says, is the land that has no heroes. And the response to him is no. Unhappy is the land that needs heroes. The point that this exchange uncovers for us is that a society is not made simply on the backs of individual acts of heroism. In fact, a society that depends on ongoing acts of individual heroism for its advance is a society that has a lot of inbuilt fragility. What we need is strong, reliable, high quality, accessible, and inclusive institutions at all levels of societies that we can draw upon, that we can rely upon, that we can use to help us advance as a community and as a society. And not only here in Canada, but then we must share that institutional strength in every part of the world where there is a need. And again, it's one of my convictions that into the future, that one of the great gifts that Canada is going to be able to give to the world is this capacity to think about how to build strong institutions that take into account public issues and public interests in a variety of ways. So that's the second principle, that we should think institutionally, not just individually, as we look past this crisis. The third principle that I would advance is the importance of knowledge and the knowledge economy and the knowledge society. Look, even pre-COVID, we were experiencing an extraordinary shift, transformation in the basis of our society and our economy. This has sometimes been called the fourth industrial revolution, the advent of the knowledge economy, where combinations of technology, capital, and knowledge were changing, and their ability to be combined in different ways were creating entire new sources of economic value and economic advance. What we have seen over the last decades has been an absolute proliferation of new methods of production in the economy, new forms of innovation in society, and new demands for the ability of knowledge and knowledge workers to contribute to advancing society. It is a huge opportunity, and it brings with it all kinds of big concerns. But one of the things we know is that the future is going to be in the hands of those who are able to continue to advance the state of the art of knowledge, to continue to learn in a lifelong way, to be able to combine advanced knowledge with an ability to collaborate with others. A recent paper by the National Bureau or published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, showed the growth of jobs in different job categories. And the only job category that has been growing and is projected to continue growing are those jobs that combined advanced state-of-the-art knowledge with the skills of collaboration, of collegiality, and of cooperation. That combination is going to be the winning combination for economic success, but also for our ability to work together and to advance as a society. Just look at the key priorities for the world as we try to confront the COVID crisis. They are all challenges of knowledge and knowledge discovery, the need for better and new testing, the need for a vaccine, of new therapeutics, new methods and models of care, new kinds of epidemiological modeling, new views and visions of population health and their prioritization. These are all questions at the frontier of human knowledge. And our ability to deal even with the crisis we're in today will be driven by how quickly our knowledge horizon advances. So this idea of embracing knowledge and the knowledge economy and the knowledge society, I think, is going to be another key principle for us to position well past the crisis. If anything, the situation we are going through is likely to accelerate the move toward the knowledge economy. And so all of us, I think, can really focus during this period on ensuring that we are clear about our own vision for how our professions, our jobs, even our interests and hobbies relate to state-of-the-art knowledge. What is our own personal learning agenda? What is our personal knowledge agenda? What are the knowledge institutions to which we are connected? How is it that we are contributing to the development and establishment and strengthening of knowledge institutions for our own community and around the world? Understanding that those knowledge institutions are likely to be the most important trampoline for progress into the future, both now, but even looking past the crisis. So that's principle number 3. My final principle is to embrace pluralism. Another thing I've drawn from my time now with the Aga Khan Development Network institutions is this understanding and appreciation of pluralism. I mean, His Highness the Aga Khan's great contribution to Canadian public discourse, it seems to me, over the last 2 decades, has been his extraordinary observation of the genius of Canadian pluralism. This idea that Canada is, while far from perfect, the most distinctive example of pluralism in action that the world is seeing. This ability to make difference work, to make people of radically different worldviews and cultures and origins come together in a community of peace and prosperity is an extraordinary thing in human culture and human history, and something that I think Canadians, in a sense, can be very proud of, but not something we can be smug about. Again, at moments of crisis, it seems to me that the possibilities of us creating divisions and, in fact, the forces against pluralism gaining strength are ever present. In fact, I think you'll know that we've seen examples around the world of the crisis being used as a pretense for many other agendas to be pursued, and many of those agendas anti-pluralist ones. So this is a time to recommit to pluralism. One of my reflections after reading and listening to people talk about pluralism a lot over the last 15 years is this idea that pluralism might be the king of virtues of a society. That is to say, the virtue from which all other important virtues of a society and of a successful society stem. If you can commit to this idea of embracing difference, not just tolerating it, not just putting up with it, not just organizing around it, but truly embracing it, celebrating it, drawing from diversity as a source of progress and advance, a source of insight and extraordinary creativity. If you can figure out how to do that, we will have been able to lay the path for a successful society across every dimension of human concern. Economically, we are seeing that the demands of collaboration and of being able to bring diverse voices together is becoming the key differentiator of the great economic entities of our time. Politically, the ability to make sure that difference does not become division is the source of long-term peace and security. As a cultural matter, we are seeing that our ability to be confident in our own cultures allows us to be more and more curious of other people's cultures and to absorb and learn from them and not to fear them. This idea of pluralism is massively powerful. But as I said, it can come under strain at moments of crisis. And so the fourth principle I want to articulate as we look past the crisis is to make sure we are recommitting to pluralism now. Even as we deal with the crisis in front of us, we do not let the forces of exclusion and of division enter in like a Trojan horse into our responses now. And if we do so, we will be setting the stones in place for a much stronger recovery and rebuild past the crisis, knowing that pluralism will be the key to social and economic advance for us after this crisis is over. So those are my four principles for speculations, for what we might hold on to as ideas and ideals, almost like anchors that help us steady the ship as we respond to the crisis and position ourselves past the crisis. One, that we must help each other, that we must maintain our sense of social solidarity. We must remember that we're not in it for ourselves, but that we are all in this together. Two, that we must think institutionally, not just individually, that we must use this moment of crisis to recommit and strengthen the key institutions that we rely on to be both a safety net, but also an engine of progress. And that we use this moment to continue to reinvent and reimagine our institutions to make them better and more suited to the opportunities and challenges ahead. Number three, that we embrace the idea of knowledge and the knowledge society, that we draw from that inspiration to invest in ourselves and in the right knowledge institutions and organizations that will be a trampoline for our progress. And finally, that we remember and cherish the notion of pluralism, that we safeguard our pluralism here in Canada and we advance it, we strengthen it, and of course we find every opportunity to share it with the world. These four principles are not only, it seems to me, practically required today. It seems to me they are also ethically required. These are not only practical ploys. I think they are actually deep ethical commitments that remind us of our commitments not only to ourselves, but to each other. That they provide a strong ethical and moral compass at a difficult time. It seems to me that we should never underestimate the power of these moral commitments, the power they have at moments of crisis especially to give us conviction and courage and to inspire us to bold action. It reminds me of one of these extraordinary stories about Abraham Lincoln that Doris Kearns Goodwin writes about in her beautiful book, Team of Rivals. She talks about Abraham Lincoln as being such an extraordinary leader during the Civil War, that he had this combination of insight and vision and kind of moral courage, along with kind of a practical and political savvy, which was really quite remarkable. One of the stories she tells is of the day he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This was the document that freed the slaves in the U.S., that recognized the ill of slavery that had essentially been one of the most important drivers of the Civil War and continued to be a source of division. It allowed Lincoln to provide a deep and abiding moral purpose to the Civil War. On the day that he was to sign it, January 1st, 1860, the White House had been opened for a traditional set of receptions where people were invited into the White House to greet the first family and wish them Happy New Year. And so for the first half of the day, Abraham Lincoln had been in the White House shaking hands for, I think, several hours. He got back to his desk to review the final draft of this most important document that ended up being an absolute turning point for the war. And that document was in front of him, and he reviewed it finally, and he realized the extraordinary moral import that he was about to lend to the war effort. And he was convinced in the rightness of what he was doing. He picked up the pen and was ready to sign the document. But just as his pen was about to hit the paper, he noticed in his hand a quiver. The muscles in his hand had weakened from a day-long set of handshaking in the reception that had preceded this moment, this important moment at his desk. And he paused. He put down the pen. And he said to his colleagues in the room, "If I sign this paper with a quivering hand, history will record that I hesitated." And he said it will weaken the moral and ethical impulse with which I am signing this document. So Lincoln pauses. He waits until the strength in his arm and his hand has returned. And then he picks up the pen, and with boldness and conviction, he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. Let us never forget the importance of this ethical commitments, the moral purpose which is called for at moments of difficulty and crisis, that we can come up with a practical agenda that is both relevant to our time as well as an expression of our deep ethical commitments to each other and to humanity. And then, with boldness and conviction, and with hope and optimism and confidence in the future, we can act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalil. It was so great to hear everything that you had to say, but of course, I must admit, it's brought a lot of questions to my mind, and I'm going to throw some at you right now. First off, really being, what can we do now as a community, as a society going forward?
Zara, what a great opening question. And of course, it is basically the most consequential question, which is what is the practical agenda of action that each of us can now adopt, both to, as I said, for both parts of this bifocal vision, both for the part of the vision with respect to the immediate needs right now, as well as for what we might do looking past the crisis. So I do think there are two or three things that come to mind immediately, and no doubt everyone will have their own list and is making their own list. The first one, as I said, is really to go out of our ways to figure out ways to help each other. I do think that we can't allow the physical distancing that we're going through to be a process of cocooning. And, you may have noticed that one of the changes that was made at some point during this process was the term social distancing became physical distancing. And I think that was exactly right, because we need to be physically distant, but kind of socially proximate in some senses. And that means kind of figuring out ways, almost being relentlessly entrepreneurial in relation to how we can go out and figure out ways to help each other during these difficult times. I think that means the people we can see around us immediately, our neighbors, our family, our friends, but also people who might be far away. And I do think that there are ways as a matter of civic action, as a matter of contributing in practical ways, volunteering, and of course, financial contributions. This is a time of, I know, extraordinary economic fragility for a lot of families in the country. But even then, we're seeing people realize that there's a real needs in the world and are coming up to make financial contributions to help what's happening around the world. So I do think that's a set of things we can do in each individually. Secondly, I do think that the point I was making about institutions, to me, is actually pretty critical. I think that we all are benefiting today from a set of institutions that were established and are built and are invested in pre-crisis. And that's, of course, it could be community institutions, it could be governments, it could be even private sector institutions. And I think that it should all give us pause about what are the institutional commitments that each one of us has, and how is it that we are contributing to strengthening and investing our own labor and time and intellect into creating strong institutions that support the entire society at times of need, for sure, but even in times of opportunity. And the third thing I would say really is to take the opportunity to continue to use this moment as a learning moment. There's not going to be any substitute, it seems to me, for advancing a learning agenda, a lifelong learning agenda, to think carefully and clearly about each of our forward knowledge priorities, and to use this time for those of us who may have extra cycles as a result of the isolation process, to use this time to invest in ourselves and our communities with respect to learning and knowledge.
Now, I know you've brought up a really interesting point as far as also being able to invest in ourselves, but you've also talked a bit about the response and what we as humanity can do to also contribute. Now, perhaps we can get some inspiration from you and understand a bit more of what Aga Khan Foundation Canada has actually been doing in response to COVID-19. So could you explain that to us a bit?
Zara, I can tell you that the response to COVID-19 globally is become our single number one priority at Aga Khan Foundation Canada, and indeed, I would say throughout the Aga Khan Development Network system globally. I mean, the entire global system has been mobilized in order to make sure that we are responding in as urgent but as thoughtful and a considerate way as we can to the alarming spread of the virus throughout the world. As you can imagine, there are many societies around the world in which the Aga Khan Development Network institutions have a long-standing presence who simply do not have the institutional strength to respond to the crisis as we do here in Canada. And so a lot of support is being required. So the support we are providing has three basic elements. Obviously, the number one priority has to be prevention of the spread of the virus, to suppress that spread. And all the public health guidelines that we, I think, have become very accustomed to here in Canada have to now be spread around the world. It's important that even at the very last mile, as we say in development, in the remote rural areas of the world, everyone understands there's this thing called COVID, that it's a serious thing, that there are certain very serious risk factors that certain parts of the population might be exhibiting and have to be pretty careful about. And then there is a certain set of simple things that everyone can do to protect themselves, their families, and their communities. So those public health messages are being spread as widely as we can. In addition, this whole idea of isolation and quarantines and lockdowns, which are spread across the world, as you can imagine, have a pretty serious economic consequence for a lot of people. The decision to have to stay at home for many parts of the world and for many families means the choice of not earning an income for the day. So in addition to the public health messaging, there is a very significant initiative to provide urgent humanitarian assistance to people who are being economically disadvantaged as a result of the lockdown measures and the spread of the virus. So that means food assistance, it means shelter, it means medicine, ensuring that people, even as they self-isolate, are able to support themselves and their families. The second big thing that we are doing is investing in the capacity of our healthcare institutions in the AKDN, and where possible, working with governments to expand their healthcare institutions to be able to respond to those and care for those who are infected. That means everything from protective equipment to masks to gloves to making sure the right training is happening, testing equipment is being procured. All of that is under full swing. And then finally, there are obviously going to be immediate but longer term economic and social consequences of this crisis. And we are already beginning to look at how we're going to manage those. Obviously, education is probably one of the most immediate issues. There's a whole swath of children who have lost weeks and weeks of schooling. It's likely that that will continue on for some time. What are we going to do as a global community to support those children who have not been able to get educated during this time? So all of those are big priorities. And I can tell you that I have spent every day of the last several weeks working on this with my colleagues around the world and at AKF Canada.
Now, you've talked a lot about the work that's being done. It's inspiring. There's so much happening. But I must admit, I never really expected a pandemic to happen, not in my lifetime, not in my generation. But now that we know it's possible, Khalil, and of course you're not a medical officer, but I am going to ask you, with the tools and the knowledge that you have, how do you think we should prepare for this in the future? We now know it can happen. So what should we do going forward?
This is, in a sense, probably the biggest puzzle that we're confronting today, which is, what does our experience over the last several weeks portend about the future? Not only about how this particular virus is going to play out its own career around the world, but what does it suggest about the next generation of viruses or other threats that were maybe not on the global agenda 8 weeks ago, but which might hit us in weeks to come? I do think that one of the things that we must spend much more investment and time on, at least in the developing world, which is, as you know, where I spend most of my time thinking about, is the whole area of disaster risk management. I mean, this has been a priority for the AKDN system going back many years. But I have to say that as a global community, our ability to invest proactively to reduce the risk of disasters and prevent disasters is very modest. We tend to invest only pennies on preparedness and risk reduction compared to the amount we end up spending to respond to crises. And this goes not only for a global pandemic like the one we're experiencing today, but even for things like natural disasters, earthquakes or avalanches, even in places where we know there are real risks. Our ability to mobilize global philanthropic and development capital to really make the investments you need to protect people so that when these things happen, they are not devastated has been very modest. So one of my aspirations, one of my hopes is that as a result of this particular crisis that has affected so many people so quickly, our antenna go way up with respect to the threat of disasters striking, and that creates more appetite and demand, frankly, for investing in the right kind of risk management, risk reduction, and preparedness activities around the world. Now, in a sense, the pandemic is just one of these examples, as I've suggested. I think there are probably a number of categories of these disaster risks which we need to catalog, understand, and then make some pretty serious choices about how we're going to invest to prepare ourselves so that we don't lose years, maybe even decades of development progress in the span of just seconds or minutes.
Now, I think, there are many opportunities for us to think forward, like you said, and to think about the future, but also to remember that we have so much more to do to stay prepared. So, Khalil, I'm going to ask you a personal question, but I think it's a question that many of us would wonder since you are so in touch with what's happening out there. What keeps you awake at night and most worried when it comes to the post-COVID time and space when we are out of all of this? What are you most worried about, and what are you thinking about so often?
Yeah, I would say, Zara, probably the thing that is most worrisome are the long-term economic consequences of the crisis for the developing world. As it is, I think that we are, even pre-COVID, I think we are at a moment, as I suggested in my remarks, at a moment of genuine economic dislocation because of the way that the basis of value creation in the economy is changing from a more industrial to a more knowledge-based economy. And while I think there's a lot of promise in that for the developing world, the actual practical policy and investment agenda to allow the knowledge economy to be democratized for most of humanity is simply not in front of us yet. We don't have a way really of extending it systematically to the great swath of humanity. And so I have to say that even before the crisis, it seems to me that the future of economic development in the developing world was a big question. And given the severity of the economic consequences we're likely to see from COVID, I actually genuinely worry about how is it we're going to get back onto a successful and promising and sustainable economic development path for most of humanity. I think that's a big conundrum. It's a big puzzle for us. And I think we really have to unleash a portfolio of creative experiments in order to start trying a number of things to see if we can begin addressing this. Now, I have to say, on balance, I do believe that the Aga Khan Development Network institutions are well positioned to try to deal with some of those. I think the investments that the AKDN system has been making in, say, higher education institutions, even in some of the most remote and rural parts of the world, position us well to try to convert those into assets for allowing societies to benefit from the knowledge economy. But I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think this is an area we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to going forward.
Now, I think one of my final questions really does stem from what you just said. With fear and worry and everything that we're feeling, lack of sleep right now because we're kept up thinking about this, there is also a chance for hope. So what are you most hopeful for at the end of this? I mean, there must be many positive things that we can think of that will come out of this. So with you being so connected everywhere, knowing what's sort of happening on the ground, but also working with partner institutions, what do you say you're most hopeful about?
Zara, I think in every crisis, what is almost always the most moving thing is genuine acts of concern and compassion and affection among people and even among strangers. And I do think that one of the things we have seen, even in this crisis, is countless examples of people going out of their way to help each other at times of need. And again, as I suggested in my remarks, it is, I think, the fount of all hope and aspiration we have for the future, that at moments of crisis, we reacquaint ourselves with the bounty of human solidarity, that when things get very, very tough, that the forces that bind us together have the capacity to overwhelm the many, many forces that can tear us apart. And every example we see of that, in my mind, is a little act of hope, an act of hope in humanity's collective ability to overcome moments of difficulty in a way that brings everyone along. And I think that I think is what I'm most hopeful for, is that the crisis brings us, in a sense, closer together as a global human community, that it gives us both the practical and ethical impulse to work together for a better world for everyone. I do think that's possible. I think in the crucible of crisis, that's often something that we can hope for and draw upon. And I've seen so many examples and ingredients of that in this current crisis that it sustains me and I think many, many people around the world.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Khalil, for taking the time to share your insight, but also to give us a little bit of hope and inspiration going forward.
Zara, it's been a real delight and a real privilege to be able to share some of these thinkings at this difficult time. And your last comment just reminded me, maybe we end with this extraordinary statement that His Highness made, indeed, just blocks from here in 2004 in Gatineau on the other side of the river when he addressed the Governor General's Leadership Conference. He was talking about difficult situations around the world, and he reminded us, he said that instability is infectious, but he said, so is hope. And I think maybe one of the final ideas that maybe we can embrace as we think about the future in relation to this crisis is that we might be the agents of making hope as infectious as this virus has been.
Now, thank you so much to Khalil for sharing his insight and his knowledge about what's going on right now and what we can hopefully expect to see for the future. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of the Ismaili Center Lecture Series, and we'll see you next time.